I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the libertarian case for the free society in a principled, uncompromising way. I don't have my co-host this week, Richard Ebeling. He's tied up, so you're going to get a solo performance from me. And I'm going to talk to you about the drug war, one of the most vicious, malicious, racist government programs, destructive government programs in our lifetime. And I'll begin by talking about this drug case that was brought in New York in federal court against a guy named Genaro Garcia Luna, who's a Mexican citizen, or was a Mexican citizen. He was head of the FBI under the administration of President Felipe Calderon. And he was charged here in this country, interestingly enough, with receiving massive amounts of bribes, like hundreds of millions of dollars of bribes from the drug cartels in Mexico to help facilitate the smuggling of drugs into the United States. Jury came back in a couple of days ago with a verdict of guilty on all counts. The guy's about 60 years old. There's no doubt the federal judge is going to end up sentencing him to the rest of his life in prison, make an example out of him, and no doubt the judge and the prosecutors will celebrate this as a great victory in the war on drugs. But it's important to ask, what's the import of this? I mean, who cares? Okay, they put another drug lord in jail, another Mexican drug lord like El Chapo or a number of others. Who cares? What difference does it make? This is just an ongoing, never-ending government program. It doesn't matter that Garcia Luna got convicted. It doesn't matter if he'd gotten acquitted. The drug war just goes on and on and on. And it's a corrupting government program. It's not just bribes in Mexico. It's bribes on this side of the border too. And even if there's no bribes, federal judges are getting these handsome salaries to handle drug cases or immigration cases. And the DEA has mortgages to pay, so they have generous salaries to do this type of thing. The whole drug war bureaucracy is dependent on the drug war, just like the drug cartels are. And they all know that if drugs were legalized, which is what we libertarians say should happen, all this would be dismantled. The drug cartels would be out of business immediately. There wouldn't be any more criminal prosecutions because there wouldn't be any more drug cartels or drug dealers. That's what happens in a legalized market. I mean, the example was like Al Capone and all the alcohol cartels and all the violence associated with prohibition. As soon as prohibition ended, the drug cartels were gone. That's why we don't see booze cartels today. Well, we see drug cartels, and that's because we got a drug war, drug prohibition program. So, so the biggest advocates of this program, of course, are the drug cartels, who would go out of business if it weren't for drug prohibition, but also the whole drug war bureaucracy. The federal judges, the DEA, the state law enforcement people that engage in the drug war, they're all dependent on this dole too. So it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. I've seen these busts since I was a kid. Let me give you some personal stories in this week's Libertarian Angle about the drug war. My personal experience with the drug war. I grew up in Laredo, Texas, which is right on the border. And Laredo's always been a hub for smuggling drugs. When I was in high school or college, my dad, who was a lawyer, was U.S. magistrate. And he was good friends with the federal judge. They went out hunting together. I'd go out on hunting trips with the federal judge. And my dad's job was to handle drug law violators that were arrested in Laredo, and then they would be brought to my dad to set bond, where they would then be returned to jail by the U.S. Marshals, and then pending the outcome of the trial, which would be before a federal judge. Well, there were times I'd be sitting in my dad's office where watching these people being brought in, like tons of people, that he would be just like a factory, a mill where one after another. One of the most maybe the most famous guy that was probably from our father was Timothy Leary. When they caught him with, I think it was marijuana there in Loretto, he was the famous LSD guru, and he later criticized my father. I was in college, and there was an interview with Leary where he said that my father was the biggest SOB he had ever seen. my father, he didn't think very highly of my father. But my point is that these cases have been going on since the 60s. I had friends in high school that were busted on marijuana possession charges by the feds and got felony convictions. And for what? What did it accomplish? The drug war is still going on. In other words, the more people they bust, it never made any difference. I remember my dad telling me once that the federal judge called him into his chambers and said, "Jack, we got a problem because we got a lot of dropsy cases taking place." And this is remarkable for a federal judge to say this, because that particular federal judge was one of the big federal drug warriors. I mean, he'd give a maximum sentence to every drug guy that would come into his courtroom and who was convicted. And he calls my dad and he says, "We got problems with dropsy cases." Well, the dropsy cases were that people at the bridge who were hippies, long hair, didn't dress real nicely. This was the 60s, remember, that the officials there at the bridge didn't like them because they were hippies, anti-war, not patriots. But they didn't catch them with any drugs, so they would just drop some marijuana in there and charge him with marijuana. And then when they'd be brought to trial, it's like, who are you going to believe? These drug officials, they wouldn't lie. But this is an old hippie, he would clearly lie. And so there were people getting convicted because of these dropsy cases. And it was interesting was that the federal judge was concerned about it, which is pretty impressive. And I don't know what they did about it. They may have issued a warning or something, but this is the corrupting aspect of the drug war. When I got back to Laredo, I had gotten my law degree at the University of Texas, and then I got my law license, and I immediately got appointed to represent an indigent client in a drug case in federal court. And it was my recollection is it was a cocaine case. Could have been heroin. I think it was cocaine though. And it was two defendants charged in a conspiracy to distribute cocaine, possess and distribute. Well, I interviewed my client, and he was saying he was innocent. He hadn't done this. Well, the other lawyer representing the other defendant, he had been appointed also to represent the other defendant. He was an experienced trial lawyer in Laredo, older guy, and he pleads his client guilty. Well, there's one thing I learned in law school is that you don't ever, as a criminal defense lawyer, plead somebody guilty that's saying he's innocent. You just can't do that. Now, there's a reason why this other lawyer may have permitted his client or maybe even encouraged his client to plead guilty, and this is a dark little secret in federal courts that is not widely advertised. And that is that even though people have a right of trial by jury guaranteed by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the fact is that federal judges will punish people for exercising that right and losing. So if you plead guilty, you'll get a sentence, a certain sentence. If you go to trial and you make this judge go to work instead of being back in his chamber reading magazines, he's going to punish you if you're found guilty. He's going to give you a higher sentence than if you had just pled guilty. This is to discourage people from going to trial and making those judges work when they could be back in their chamber reading magazines. So that could be why that experienced trial lawyer permitted his client to plead guilty, or maybe even encouraged his client to plead guilty. But I wasn't going to do that. My client said he was innocent, and that's the way it's going to be. Now, I went to the federal prosecutor, an assistant U.S. attorney, an experienced lawyer, and I said, look, why don't you give me all the DEA reports, and I'll show them to this guy, just in case it's so overwhelming that he changes his mind. The guy says, fine, here you are. He knew I was a brand new lawyer. I'd never tried a case in my life. But I had taken a trial advocacy course in law school. And I had skipped a lot of law school classes that I found were quite boring to go into the law library to study trial advocacy, cross-examination, direct examination. This is what I wanted to do. So he gives me all his files. I mean, it's thick. I mean, huge number of files by an enormously large number of DEA agents. Well, I showed him to this guy and didn't change his mind. He says, I didn't do this. Well, so I took all these reports home and I started studying them every day and every night, just poring over them, examining, charting out where everybody was and what everybody did. And I finally figured out that this guy was right. It was a setup. It was just a total setup by the DEA. What had obviously happened was they were convinced this guy was dealing in drugs, that both of them were dealing in drugs, but they couldn't catch him. And so they figured, well, we'll just set him up and frame him on drugs, and it'll be justice. It all works out because we can't catch him doing what we know that they're doing. So we go to trial, and as each DEA agent is being called up to the witness stand by the assistant U.S. attorney to establish the case, I start asking them some very pointed questions. And I start bringing out this mosaic with my questions as to what they had done. But I do it piecemeal. It's like little torture. And after a while, they figured out that I had figured out what they had done by my question, my cross-examination. And the jury was intrigued by what was going on, too. And so all of a sudden, some of the DEA agents started coming up to me and asking to be excused, the ones that hadn't testified yet. Because I had subpoenaed them all. And I was going to call them all to the stand. I was going to show the jury what these people had done. And so they come over and say, oh, well, I'm going on vacation. Can you excuse me? Or I've got something else to do. Can you excuse me? And I said, well, wait a minute now. My client can't go on vacation. Why should you guys go on vacation? You know, this is a trial. So I didn't agree to excuse any of them. And another thing to know is that, you see, I could subpoena everybody for free because this was an indigent case, which means an indigent client can subpoena people without paying witness fees. So we didn't have to pay any fees. And so in the middle of the trial, I'm walking down the hall during a lunch recess, and right past the prosecutor's office, and he calls me into his office. He says, hey, would you mind coming in here? And in there is a DEA agent. And so the prosecutor says to me, we've received information that you've been in touch with one of the jurors. And we don't want to make a big fuss of this. We just want you to agree to excuse that juror, and we'll have one of the alternates take her place. Well, you know, I may have been a new attorney, but boy, I could sense a trap a mile away. I mean, if I'd agreed to that deal, I would have been admitting what they were saying. And instead, I was fuming. And I said to this prosecutor, let me tell you something, you little son of a whatever. You and I are going into that federal judge's office right now, and we are going to get to the bottom of this. And I just got up and wheeled around and started storming down the hall towards the judge's chambers. And this guy's chasing me saying, wait, we need to talk about this. You know, well, I wasn't in the mood to talk with him about anything. And so I stormed right past the judge's secretary, the receptionist, and without knocking, I just walked right into the judge's chambers. You see, new lawyers can get away with a lot. And, well, needless to say, this judge was a little stunned. And I mean, you don't generally do that to a federal judge. And the prosecutor's right behind me, and he's looking at me with a stunned look on his face. And I said, Judge, this man has just accused me of jury tampering, and I demand a hearing right now where I'm going to call him to the stand. I'm going to call the DEA agent that was in his office, made the same allegation, to the stand. I demand the right to get to the bottom of this false accusation. And so the judge turns to the prosecutor and says, Joe, what's this all about? And Joe says, well, Your Honor, we saw one of the jurors smiling at Mr. Hornberger, and we checked her out, and it turns out that she's got a relative that was under drug charges. She didn't disclose that in the voir dire, in the jury examination when we were selecting the jury. So we figured something's up here. So the judge says, that's it? That's why you accused him of jury tampering? Yes, Your Honor. And so the judge says, Joe, I think you owe Mr. Hornberger an apology. Yes, Your Honor. I'm sorry, Mr. Hornberger. So we go back out and we continue the trial. And the case is given to the jury. And lo and behold, the jury comes back in with a not guilty verdict. My very first jury trial in federal court, not guilty. And my client walks out of the courtroom a free man. And he should have. he was clearly innocent of what they were charging him with. But the judge was still in an awkward position because there was the other defendant. You see, in a conspiracy, you got to have two people to conspire, and one of them's just found not guilty of conspiracy. Now you got one who's left who's pled guilty to conspiracy. It's a little awkward, and so the judge avoided the problem by giving that guy probation. But it just goes to show you how corrupting this program is. I mean, you got DEA agents setting people up because they can't convict them of something that they're convinced they're guilty of, accusing lawyers of jury tampering. I mean, this is how corrupting this whole program is. And it's not just the Mexicans that are on the drug war take. It's also the Americans too. There's a lot of people over here on the take. This is a corrupting influence on everybody. But the big point is that how long this has been going on. I was there handling drug cases in 1975. Interestingly enough, the DEA agents came in such force in Laredo in the 70s when I was there. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, we were doing a gangbuster business. These drug defendants would come in and hire us, my dad and me, and I mean, they'd bring cash, and man, you count out, $5,000, $10,000 in cash right there as a retainer fee. It was quite an interesting experience. But then the drug business started moving over to Miami, and much of the chagrin of the criminal defense lawyers in Laredo who had been making a killing off of them. But then it ultimately came back when they cracked down in Miami. In other words, the more they crack down, the more the drug deals keep going on. They've been cracking down on drug lords since the 60s. Take a look at a drug war series called Narcos on Netflix. It's a fantastic series. It's about, they're going after Pablo Escobar, one of the famous drug lords, probably the wealthiest drug lord ever in history. But as soon as they kill him, his competitors rise up and they're taking the place of Escobar's operation. And there's another case, another Netflix series called Narcos Mexico that is fantastic. It revolves around the torture and execution of a DEA agent named Kiki Camarena, who was operating out of Guadalajara. What's the DEA doing in Guadalajara? I mean, aren't drug laws supposed to be here for the United States? So that's a fantastic series. But again, it's the same thing. They knock out the drug gang that kills Camarena, and it's quickly replaced by a new drug gang. This is the way black markets work. That you talk to any economist that you knock out one, somebody immediately comes in and substitutes for them. You can't knock them all out because there's always somebody ready to take the place of the previous guy, especially when there's big money involved. And here's the other irony of this. The more they crack down, the higher the price goes, which then attracts more people to go into the drug business. And that's why a lot of regular people have gone into the drug business. Airline flight attendants or whatever that, see a way to make an easy, quick, large amount of money smuggling drugs back into the country. It's just this perverse system that lures people. I mean, we go to church on Sunday and we pray the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation, but we've got this government program that is really based on temptation with the exorbitant prices and profits that can be made. I mean, you score big on a marijuana sale. I mean, you can retire for a year or so. And if you see this series Narcos Mexico, I mean, they were making hundreds of millions of dollars. The news media reported that this guy Garcia Luna in New York, in bribes alone, made hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, I'm sure he had to share it. But that gives you an idea of what these drug lords are making, more likely in the billions of dollars. And it never stops. I mean, when I was in Laredo, they would have the record drug bus, okay? Where the big record. I was representing one of these guys. They found cocaine in his vehicle. It was all inside the panels of the car. Huge amount of cocaine. It was a record cocaine drug bust up to that time. And I was representing this guy. And this was one tough guy. I mean, just toughest guy I think I've ever seen. and he was like a phoenix in court. Just never changed expressions. And the thing about representing these guys is you always had to be really careful that they never got the sense that you were selling them out. I mean, you never could cooperate with the prosecutor or have a cup of coffee with the prosecutor, which lawyers tend to do on opposing sides, because you walk out of the courtroom, it's nothing personal. Hey, let's go get lunch together. And then you get back in the courtroom and you fight it out. You never could do this in a drug case because the drug defendant would think that you were selling him out, which is a lot of times what would happen in Mexico. So the prosecutor came to me in this case and said, we'd like you to stipulate that this really is cocaine. Just agree that it's cocaine so that we don't have to bring the guy down from Austin, the forensics chemist that established that it really was cocaine. And I said, I ain't stipulating to anything. So they had to bring the cocaine into the courtroom, and it was like stacked in bales on the defense table and on the prosecutor table because there wasn't enough room. And it was like really high. And you'd walk by it, and it would kind of like fluff out the cocaine like a little cloud. I think everybody was high that particular day in the courtroom, and they had to bring the chemist in to say, yeah, he did these tests, and that really is cocaine. Well, the jury went back in to deliberate and sent a note to the judge saying, do we have to come back in and deliver the verdict in person? Because they were so scared of this guy. And the judge says, well, yep, you got to do that. And, of course, they found the guy guilty. But the record drug busts have been going on year after year after year, and each time they celebrate, a record drug bust. This goes on all across the country, where there's major media publicity, and they'll photograph the cocaine or the marijuana or the heroin and a record drug bust, and they sort of think this is like evidence of progress. Well, how can it be evidence of progress when you're establishing new record drug busts as the years go on? It's ridiculous. The progress would mean that there's no more records being set, that you're only catching minute amounts of drugs. So this is what's been going on for decades. I mean, you go all the way back to Billie Holiday when they used the drug war to destroy her. I mean, she's a drug addict, okay, fine. But this goes back to the racist roots of the drug war. And there's no question, that this is a racist government program. And every black in America knows, especially inner city blacks, that this is the most racist government program since segregation, possibly even more than segregation. The penitentiaries are filled with people, filled with blacks, because it falls disproportionately on them. Now, I'm not saying that every federal judge and every federal prosecutor and every DEA agent and every local drug law enforcement agent's a bigot. Clearly that is not true. But I am saying that this government program, because it is racist in nature, attracts racist bigots. And so when a federal judge or a state judge is a racial bigot, this gives him his perfect opportunity to exercise his bigotry and to do it in a very legitimate manner. You see this with bigoted law enforcement agents where they just arbitrarily stop blacks walking down the street, and they stop them and they humiliate them with ridiculous questions. They'll pat them down. If they even object at all, they'll beat them up and charge them with resisting arrest. Or they'll do the drop C cases that I talked about earlier. They'll drop drugs and charge him with drugs. And then, you get to court and say, who are you going to believe, this law enforcement officer or this guy? And everybody knows, at least in the black community, that this government program has always fallen disproportionately on blacks. And yet it remains in existence. It's a crooked, corrupt, racist government program. And there's no end to it. That's the thing you got to realize. There is no end to this government program. It's a perpetual government program. It's like the war on terrorism, and it involves massive destruction of liberty, massive destruction of life. We see the violence in this country, massive violence. People ask, why is there so much violence in America? Well, hello. You get rid of the drug war, you legalize drugs, and you would get rid of most of the violence in America. But it's nothing. As bad as it is here, it's nothing compared to Mexico. It's the estimates on deaths in Mexico from the drug war number in the hundreds of thousands. And I'm not talking about deaths from drugs. I'm talking about from the drug war, because they brought the military in. Here in the United States, the military is not permitted to participate in enforcement of the drug war. because Americans think it's a bad idea to use the military for law enforcement. But the hypocrisy of it all, U.S. officials encouraged the Mexican government to use its military. And the result was just massive violence. And it hasn't gone away. The Mexican government just a few weeks ago initiated an ambush of one of the sons of El Chapo, who is sitting in a federal penitentiary here for drug violations. And that ambush was deadly. I mean, they captured the guy, but I think there was 10 or 11 soldiers killed, many more wounded. For what? For what? I mean, El Chapito, the guy they arrested, he's got two brothers who are still managing the drug business. It's just a cost of doing business. Okay, El Chapito ends up in jail for a few years or several years. Who cares? What did those soldiers die for? They died for nothing. Absolutely nothing. This is the type of thing, the massive violence. And then there's the massive destruction of liberty. Civil liberties here in America, privacy, search and seizure, no-knock raids, asset forfeiture, where they're stopping blacks and Hispanics driving down the highway. They ask them if they have cash, and they innocently respond. They tell the truth. They have cash. Their business depends on cash or whatever. And the cops are empowered now to just steal the money. Just take it. Under the pretense that, it must be drug related. It can't be anything like, they have a gardening service, or they're going over to another town to buy a used car or something. No, it can't be anything legitimate. It's got to be drug related. And then the law says, well, if you don't like it, you can sue them for your money back. Well, how are these poor people going to sue for their money back? Their money's been taken from them. But no lawyer's going to handle it for free, or at least not very many lawyers are going to handle it for free. So this is great, big cash bonanza. Most people don't sue to get their money back, and boy, the DEA is making out like bandits, and that's what they are, is bandits, and along with the law enforcement agents. But my point is that throughout the years, they keep enacting more and more screws to tighten up on people. Search and seizure, asset forfeiture, privacy violations, no-knock raids, and the screw's just getting tighter and tighter, but nothing changes in a positive sense. It doesn't enable them to win the war on drugs or to get closer to the war on drugs winning. All it does is just keep tightening the screws that further turn American people into serfs, little tiny serfs whose existence is to serve the state and have their freedoms destroyed in the process. There's only one real solution to this thing, and that's the legalization of drugs. That was the solution on booze. Legalize booze. Okay, yeah, people drink alcohol. They die from alcohol. In fact, a lot more people die from alcohol and cigarettes, tobacco, than they do from illicit drugs. But we don't want to make those things illegal because we know what happens. But for some reason, these federal officials are just convinced. They remain convinced that if they just keep fighting this war on drugs, everything will turn out hunky-dory. And now those DEA agents and those prosecutors, when I was practicing law back in the 70s, they're all retired. Maybe they're dead. But if they're retired, they're on their generous pensions. And this new flock of DEA agents, same mindset. Oh, we're going to win the war on drugs, Jacob. Oh, we just got a conviction in New York. Oh, my gosh. Yeah, we're getting closer, Jacob. It's ridiculous. Because another 30 years from now, they're all going to be retired or dead, and it's going to be the new crop of federal judges, federal prosecutors that are going to say, we're going to win the war on drugs. There's only one real solution to this, and that is ditch this program and ditch it now. And that means the legalization of all drugs, not just marijuana, fentanyl, cocaine, heroin, meth. Legalize them all, opioids.